Welcome to the Los Angeles World Affairs Council and Town Hall. I'm Kim McClary, President and CEO, and it's my great pleasure to welcome you to today's program. Thank you all for your continued support. Since March 2020, we have produced over 140 live streams for you on the most compelling and timely issues. All of our live streams are available for viewing on our website, so please go to our website and check some of those out. As a small nonprofit, we depend upon your support by becoming a member, making a donation, and being a viewer of our programs. We are providing these live streams for free as a public service, so please visit our website to find out the many opportunities to help keep us going. Thank you so much. For those of you who would like to ask Dan a question, there's a control panel on the right-hand side of your screen where you can type in your questions. Our Jessica DeGanzik, Vice President of Events, will be managing your questions during the Q&A portion of today's program, which will start in about 35 minutes. So without further ado, Dan, let's introduce your weekly Politics in the Time of Coronavirus. We're so thrilled to have you back again with all of these interesting news headlines. The topics that you have today are really interesting. Firstly, women in politics, how far have we come? 2, Biden's second 100 days from COVID relief to economic brawls. And 3rd, what a Biden-Putin would look like. Dan, this is a terrific lineup. I wish we had more than an hour to discuss it.
Well, Kim, thank you very much. And I'm struck. I can't believe that the World Affairs Council Town Hall has done over 140 programs since the shutdown. I think we've done 55 or 60 of these weekly webinars, but the fact that you've done so many other things is really, really extraordinary. So thanks to you.
Thanks to you, Dan. You're our anchor, so thank you so much.
Well, let's get going. Joe Biden began his speech to a joint session of Congress last week with the following words. He said, quote, "Madam Speaker, Madam Vice President." And then he said, "No president has ever said those words from this podium. No president has ever said those words. And it's about time," unquote. Well, the picture of Vice President Harris and Speaker Pelosi was, of course, historic. And I should hasten to add that I don't mean this as a partisan point. You can cheer for Harris and Pelosi, or for Nikki Haley and Lynn Cheney, or for Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, or for Ivanka Trump, for that matter. Regardless, what we saw last week was an important moment in history, and one that's long overdue. So originally, when Jessica and Claire and I began to plot out this week's program, originally today's webinar was going to start by talking about President Biden's next 100 days and his goals moving forward. And we'll get to that shortly. But with the exception of William Henry Harrison, who was our nation's 9th president and who passed away exactly 1 month into his presidency in 1848, except for William Henry Harrison, every president gets a second 100 days in office. But this is the first time that the persons first and second in line of presidential succession are women. And last week, of course, was the first time a female vice president and female speaker sat behind the president during a joint address to Congress. So let's start with that history. And before I dig in any deeper, Claire, if we can put up the first question for the group looking forward. So question for all of you. What do you think? When will the first female president of the United States be elected? Will it be in the next election cycle in 2024? Will it be 4 years after that in 2028? Will it be in 2032, 11 years from now? Or alternatively, do you think it'll be later than that, but someday? Or finally, do you think it's never going to happen, that this country will never elect a woman as president of our country? So let's see our results. Very interesting. I'd call it measured, perhaps very measured optimism. 48%, almost half of you, say that a female president will first be elected in 2028. and only 20%, 1/5, say that will happen in the next election. I presume some of that may be from those of you who believe that President Biden will seek a second term and be reelected. But it is worth noting that more than 2/3 of us believe a woman will be elected president of this country by the end of the decade. An additional 9% say in 2032. 22% say someday, but maybe not that soon. And somewhere out there's a few of you who don't think it's ever going to happen. We'll need to find a way to dig into that deeper in a future series of questions. But let's look at the numbers as they stand today. So there are currently 120 women in the US House of Representatives out of 435 members. That's 27%, which is an all-time record. There are 24 women in the US Senate, which is one less than the all-time record set in the last Congress. And in case you're not any better at math than I am, that's 24%. The combined percentage of the two is just over 25%, which ranks 75th among the world's 192 democracies. I will admit I did not know that there were 192 democracies in the world until I began researching for today's program, but there we are, we're 75th. And in case you're wondering, the countries of Rwanda, Cuba, and Bolivia are the top 3 in terms of female elected representation. They're the only countries in the world with more than half of at least one chamber of their national legislature being made up of women. Here in the US, there are 12 women in President Biden's cabinet, 8 female governors in the United States, 10 if you count the governors of Puerto Rico and Guam. And of course, there are 3 women on the US Supreme Court, which is 33.3% of that body. There are 2,284 women in state legislatures around the country. That's a little bit more than 30% of state legislatures. And in the state of Nevada, slightly more than 60% of the members of their legislature are women. It's the only state in the country in which there are more female legislators than men. 8 of the nation's 24 largest cities, also exact 1/3, 8 of the nation's 24 largest cities have female mayors, including the mayors of Chicago and Phoenix, Charlotte, Boston, Seattle, and San Francisco, and others. Of course, 52% of the population is women. 57% of US college students are women, and the majority of US voters are women. So while progress is being made, and it's instructive to see that as you work your way down to lower offices, the percentages do increase, but there's obviously still quite a ways to go. So question number 2 for you, we've asked you when you think the first female will be elected president. Now we want to ask you who you think it'll be. So do you think Vice President Kamala Harris will be the first woman elected president? Do you think Nikki Haley, the former governor of South Carolina and ambassador to the United Nations, will be elected as the first Republican to become the female president? Do you think it'll be another Democrat other than Harris, or another Republican other than Haley? Or once again, for those of you who don't think it's ever going to happen, you have an option available to you there. So let's see what the answers look like. Interesting, very interesting. 46% of you, almost half, believe that Kamala Harris will be the first female president. And if you add up another Democrat, we'll have to break down this question further with other potential alternatives in a future webinar. 82%, more than 8 in 10 of you, believe that the first female president will be a Democrat. Only 10% say Nikki Haley, and 7% say another Republican. And those few naysayers from our first question seems like they've rethought their answer. So obviously there's a lot of progress that's been made, but even more obviously, there's a lot more work to be done. What I'd like to talk about for a few minutes before we go on to our next topic is what that path forward is going to look like. And I'm going to reference a book that I use in one of my classes in this discussion, a terrific book written about 10 years ago, 11 years ago now, called Notes from the Cracked Ceiling. And for those of you who remember Hillary Clinton's famous concession speech to Barack Obama after the 2008 primary, that's where the title comes from. And while the book is slightly dated at this point, it still provides, in my opinion, the best analysis of both challenges and opportunities faced by female political candidates. The author is Ann Kornblut, Kornblut, and Ann was the political editor of the Washington Post when she wrote the book. She's now the head of the news division at Facebook. But she begins the book by examining the 2008 presidential campaign, by talking both about Hillary Clinton's campaign for president and Sarah Palin's campaign for vice president. And then as the book goes on, she expands to look at a range of other successful female political leaders: Nancy Pelosi, Amy Klobuchar, Janet Napolitano, the former governor of Arizona, Claire McCaskill, the former senator from Missouri, and several others. And in her book, Ann Kornblut offers a number of observations that are still very valid today. And I'll offer you a few of the challenges she outlines, but also a few of what she sees as opportunities for female political leaders. One of the greatest challenges that she identified back in 2008, and many researchers believe still exists today, is an immense generation gap. And let me explain what she meant by that. And I'm going to start by telling a story that Ann Kornblut recounts right at the very beginning of her book. Kornblut talks about a conversation that Geraldine Ferraro had in 2008 with her adult daughter. And Ferraro's daughter told her that she, the daughter, was going to vote in a Democratic primary, not for Hillary Clinton to make her the first president of the United States, but rather for Senator Barack Obama. And Ferraro's response to her daughter was something along the lines of, "Are you kidding me?" And began to remind her daughter of what she, Ferraro, had fought to achieve over the course of her career. And what Kornblut then explores is that while female voters of my generation and slightly older and younger, female voters of a certain age, if you will, tended to put a much higher priority on the election of a woman president than younger women, than millennials and now Gen Z female voters do. And what research shows is that for women who lived through earlier challenges, they tended to see the election of the female president of being as much more historical import, while younger women agreed of the importance of electing a female president, but were less inclined to see the urgency of it. And like Geraldine Ferraro's daughter, they felt in 2008 that the election of the nation's first African-American president was a more important historical breakthrough. And many of those same younger people, or their younger siblings, I should say, in 2016 and 2020, decided that while they would like a female to be president, they made their decision based on other criteria. And as time passes, that generational gap understandably shrinks. But the biggest mistake that Clinton made in that 2008 campaign was her team assumed that all female voters, or most female voters, would be inclined to support her candidacy. And what they found as the campaign rolled forward is that, like Geraldine Ferraro's daughter, younger women were much more inclined to support Barack Obama. And they found the same thing. Although they were able to ultimately be successful, they found the same thing in the 2016 campaign. Young women who supported Bernie Sanders in very great numbers over Clinton, wanting to see a female president someday, but not that particular one. One of the other challenges that Ann Kornblut talks about in the book is the question of toughness and strength, traditionally masculine qualities that are associated much more with executive leaders than legislative leaders. And there's a terrific episode in the book, there's a wonderful episode in the book, in which Ann recounts a famous instance from the campaign trail in which Clinton was campaigning in New Hampshire after having lost the Iowa caucuses to Obama. And when she's asked by a female voter how she manages to go forward, Hillary Clinton begins to tear up a little bit. She doesn't cry but there are clearly tears in her eyes. And her advisors, a mostly male team at that point 13 years ago, thought that was it, that a female candidate who showed a weakness was just done for. And in fact, the exact opposite happened. Clinton came back from behind and won the New Hampshire primary. And many observers believe that by lowering her emotional shield just a little bit and showing whether you want to call it some weakness, some vulnerability, some emotional connection, that Clinton actually benefited from that rather than so singularly emphasizing the strength and toughness questions, which her team had thought would be the key to her campaign success. And then third, Ann Kornbluth talks about the double standards that women faced in 2008, still face in 2021, and will face for many years to come. She talks about double standards in terms of a female leader's age, the clothing they wear, the so-called perfection syndrome. And while as society evolves, these double standards diminish slightly, they diminish slowly and are still far from gone. But what Ann Kornbluth also talks about are some opportunities, and I realize we're taking up a good portion of our first half an hour on this today, but I hope you'll stick with me on it, even if it means putting one of our other two topics off until next week. Because Ann Kornbluth also, in Notes from the Cracked Ceiling, talks about the opportunities that are available for female leaders, not just female politicians, but women who want to lead in other areas as well. And what she points to first is research shows that female leaders have some built-in advantages in terms of perception from the voters. All other things considered equal, female leaders are seen as having more moral authority than men. They're seen more credibly as agents of change. They're generally seen as more honest and more likely to pursue anti-corruption goals. And while historically women were judged as more credible on issues like schools, on education, and healthcare, more recently, female candidates have begun to develop an advantage on economic issues as well. And the advantages that male candidates have historically held on defense and crime issues, while still there, is much smaller than was in the past. Another point that Ann makes is she talks about the importance, also based on extensive research, the importance of female leaders reinforcing their message with credibility from the work they've done in the past. The line she uses, which I just love, is she says, quote, "You have to slay a dragon," unquote. And what Ann means by that is for a female candidate, even more than a man, unfortunately, the successful female leaders need to point to past accomplishments to give them credibility in the political arena. This is Elizabeth Warren last year with her famous line, "I've got a plan for that," to give her credibility that she'd earned on the issues on which she ran. Another way that's been put is they say, "Speak softly and carry a big statistic," which is, of course, a play on Teddy Roosevelt's famous line, "Speak softly and carry a big stick." And once again, a female candidate who can point to specific data for credibility and authority tends to be much more successful. Now, of course, this is another double standard because it's something that's required more by a female candidate than a male potential leader. But I think Ann Kornbluth's advice is valuable because it shows how a woman can overcome those double standards in order to succeed. Last thought is research that she cites shows that women are less likely to be recruited to run and must be need to be more self-motivated. Now, to some degree, while that analysis still holds 13 years later, it's not as strong as it was in 2008 because both parties are beginning to realize to a much greater degree the importance of recruiting and encouraging supporting female candidates. Democrats obviously have a significant advantage in this regard, but last year it's worth noting that most of the new members of Congress who Republicans elected to the House of Representatives were female candidates, greatly expanding their numbers in the House of Representatives. And the long-term efforts in this regard by organizations like Emerge on the Democratic side, and the Marion Bergeson Foundation on the Republican Party are organizations specifically designed to recruit and train and prepare young women to run for elective office. Anyway, I realize we spent a lion's share of our time on that issue, but I think you'd agree that using that photo of Vice President Harris and Speaker Pelosi as a jumping off point, we really did accomplish something extremely important. We really did accomplish something extremely important from a historical standpoint. And I hope you'd agree that it was worth taking the time to go through. So Claire, what I'm going to do, just to warn you, is I am going to skip through issue 2, Biden's next 100 days, because largely that's something, as I said earlier, we'll be talking about Biden's fight to pass his infrastructure package for the next several months. So let's put that topic aside for right now, knowing that we'll come back to it next week. And let's go instead to topic 3, the prospect of a summit meeting between President Biden and President Vladimir Putin of Russia. So when Biden mentioned earlier this year that he wanted a summit meeting with Putin, it seemed to a lot of people, myself included, like sort of a toss-away line. But now it's looking like that summit is very likely to happen, possibly as early as next month. Biden's going to be traveling to Great Britain in June for a meeting of the G7, the US and its 6 strongest allies. But it now appears that after the G7 meeting, he'll travel elsewhere in Europe. And as part of that European visit, the talks for him and Putin meeting face-to-face in some third country are getting more and more serious. Now, as I've mentioned before in this program, Biden is the first president of the modern era not to begin his time in office by promising to improve relations with Russia. He's even referred to Vladimir Putin as a quote-unquote killer. But it's important to understand how Biden views our challenge with Russia, especially in contrast to what he sees as the much more important work that needs to be done with China. Biden views them as 2 very different superpower adversaries that are seeking to exploit America's divisions, but in very, very different ways. And so Biden has begun, and you saw it a little bit in his speech to Congress last week, Biden is trying to make the case that our country must compete with a rising power in China, which is a generational challenge, while he looks at Russia primarily as a disruptor. And that characterization between a rising power and longtime power on one hand, and sort of a annoyance on the other, that characterization carries over to his assessment of the 2 countries' leaders. Biden regards the Chinese president, Xi Jinping, as a worthy competitor who will force America to up its game. And you hear him talking about this in the context of his infrastructure package. That's why he focused in his speech so much on education, on broadband internet access, and partnership with industries and new technologies. Biden has made it clear to his aides, and will continue to make it clear to the rest of us, that his administration sees China as an existential threat to the world, in which China would dominate in trade and technology. And so that is a much bigger, broader, longer-term challenge. On the other hand, Biden regards Putin mainly as a troublemaker, and Russia as a declining power whose only real capability is to act as a disruptor that seeks to split NATO, to undermine democracy when it can, and to poke holes in the computer and communications network that the United States and the rest of the world depends on. So while Biden has made some effort to shore up US relations with Europe before sitting down with Putin, Biden, is clearly devoting much more time to laying the groundwork for his first meeting with Xi. Next week, President Biden is meeting with South Korean President Moon at the White House. His first in-person meeting with any foreign leader was Japan's Prime Minister Suga. So this administration is devoting an immense amount of time to strengthening Pacific Rim relationships because Biden knows that China is a much greater challenge. But he also knows that in the meantime, Russia has the ability to cause many, many problems. That's why Secretary of State Anthony Blinken is going to Ukraine this week to send a message of solidarity and support to the people of that country. Biden knows he's going to have to deal with Putin on questions relating to Ukraine, on questions regarding Alexei Navalny, the Russian opposition leader, on questions relating to the construction of Russia's gas pipeline to Europe, the Nord Stream 2. Not to mention, of course, Russia's past election interference and cyber attacks. And Biden also knows that these conversations with Putin have to take place in person. And it looks like that face-to-face conversation is about to happen. So it was going to be the fifth question of the day, but Claire, I guess will be our third question of the day instead. Let's find out what you think. Based on this approach, when Biden leaves office, will the US-Russia relationship be, number one, dramatically better, two, slightly better, third, dramatically worse, fourth, slightly worse, and fifth, the same? What does everybody think? So, wow, look at that. Wow. 53% say slightly better, more than half. Add the few people who think that the relationship will be dramatically better, and we got 57% who think that this approach will improve relations with Russia. 16% say the relationships will worsen, either dramatically at 5% or slightly worse at 11%. And about a quarter of you, slightly more, 27% of you, think that Biden's approach will not necessarily change relationships with Russia in one way or another. So, of course, when the summit does take place, we'll make it one of the topics that we talk about. You can bet on that. Because the president is meeting with South Korean leader Moon next week, I think that'll give us an opportunity to revisit for the first time in a couple months the US-China relationship. But one other thing that we'll definitely talk about next week is we will talk about Biden's second 100 days because we've got about 90 of those 100 days left. But it is going to be helpful to us, and it's going to be important for the country to see how Biden proceeds on his next great domestic challenge. Because just briefly, before we bring Jessica into the conversation, what I would tell you is not only is the infrastructure package that Biden has laid out a much, much more ambitious one, it's going to require an entirely different skill set than the one he used to pass the COVID relief legislative package, which began his presidency. For the first 100 days of his presidency, Joe Biden was able to unify the Democratic Party and pass with great popular support a COVID relief package by not being Donald Trump. And that's not a criticism of Biden, but he recognized that the Trump administration's handling of the pandemic was viewed by many as one of the reasons that voters turned on Trump in last November's election. And so simply being the un-Trump in that discussion was sufficient. But now it gets more challenging because this infrastructure package, both traditional physical infrastructure and the broader array of social services, which the Biden administration is referring to as social infrastructure, that is, like I said, it's not just a bigger challenge, but it's going to require Biden to define himself to the American people in a much different way than he did either during the campaign or in his first 100 days in office. And next week, we can talk more about how he intends to do that and what it's going to look like. But that's next week. So for this week, let's see if Jessica is willing to join us. there she is. She is willing to join us.
Sure.
And hopefully with 2 topics instead of 3, we still have enough questions to get us through the next half an hour.
We definitely do. The first question, does the probable unseating of Liz Cheney and the booing of Mitt Romney mean the Republican Party is no longer a true representation of conservative values and is now just a cult of Trump?
Well, we've talked before about the very stark divisions in the Republican Party between what I call the pre-Trump Republicans, those who defined traditional conservatism before Donald Trump became the party's nominee and then president. And in addition, on one hand, you have the pre-Trump Republicans, and on the other hand, the pro-Trump Republicans, who define conservatism more as it relates to Trump's agenda while in office, and less as Republicans had traditionally defined it in the modern era, from either Nixon or Reagan, depending on how you count, moving forward. And it's pretty clear that that division is going to continue to deepen. Liz Cheney, the representative from Wyoming, who is currently number 3 in the House leadership, is almost certain to be removed from that position. For those of you who haven't seen it, she and Republican leader Kevin McCarthy have been increasingly at odds. And for those of you who didn't see it, just earlier today, apparently Representative McCarthy was on television. And when he thought he was off microphone, referring to Cheney, he said, "I've just about had it with her." A live mic picked it up. But if it's possible for an already bad relationship to get even worse, I suspect that's about to happen. And Cheney almost certainly will be replaced as the number 3 Republican in the House leadership. And that decision, like the booing that Mitt Romney got when he spoke to the Utah Republican Convention over the weekend, suggests that even while Trump is now, it's now been 6 months since the election. It's now been 3.5 months since the inaugural, that the pro-Trump wing of the Republican Party is not going away. And this division will probably not be settled during next year's midterm elections, and probably won't be settled until the party picks its next presidential nominee in 2024.
Do you think with secret balloting that Liz Cheney can maintain her role as a Republican show a real disdain for Trumpism?
I don't think Cheney will be able to retain her role, and I don't think that bothers her particularly. It's pretty clear that since January 6th, excuse me, when Cheney saw the reaction, her comments after the riots in the Capitol took place, it's become pretty clear since then that Cheney realized that she did not have a future in the House Republican leadership. And in fact, her political future is better served, in her opinion, by actively confronting the pro-Trump wing of the Republican Party. In the past, when leading Republicans have done that, Senator Jeff Flake, Senator Bob Corker from Tennessee, and others, those people have been harmed pretty badly. But Cheney's confident that she has a sufficiently solid base of support in her home state, and that there are enough pre-Trump Republicans across the political landscape. But I think she at this point appears to believe that her stature and prospects for higher office will not be harmed by taking on Trump so directly, but actually be helped.
This next question, what is the appeal of the GOP for Hispanic women in places like Texas and elsewhere?
Well, there's a wonderful article, for those of you who didn't see it, in yesterday's New York Times that talked precisely about this issue. And my guess is that the questioner saw the article also. Now, as we know from the election results last November, we know that Trump did surprisingly well, or surprising at least to many people, among Latino voters, not just in Florida, where there's a much larger population of individuals whose families came from Cuba, Nicaragua, or from Venezuela, but in other parts of the country as well. And one of the regions that's gotten the most attention, and this is what the New York Times story yesterday focused on, is the Rio Grande Valley, the area in southern Texas, directly adjacent to the US-Mexican border, where Trump did much better than expected among Latinos of both genders, both male Latinos and female Latinas. And what seemed to be the case for many of these voters is while they were not especially enthusiastic about Trump's agenda on immigration issues, they saw that as less important as other issues on which they agreed with him. Many of these voters live in small town in rural Texas. And as we've talked about many times in the past, small town and rural areas over the last 4 years is where Trump enjoyed his greatest base of support. Many of these voters work in the oil industry and saw Trump as a much more reliable ally to their jobs and their livelihoods than they saw the Democratic candidates. Many of them are religious conservative and decided that Trump's positions on issues like abortion and same-sex marriage were closer to theirs than the alternatives. So what we've seen, and I wouldn't overstate it because Democrats, of course, still enjoy support from much larger numbers of Hispanic Americans than Republicans do. But what we do see is that there is a certain percentage of Latino and Latinas of both genders who, while they regard immigration as an issue of import to them, don't always necessarily rank it as the most important issue. And other economic and cultural issues tend to get more attention to them. Complicating matters even further for Democrats in this region is not only do many people who live here work in the oil industry, but many of them are directly impacted by the flow of immigrants who come over the US-Mexican border. And we've seen even a great number of Democratic elected officials in Texas, in New Mexico, and Arizona, all urging the Biden administration to confront the border crisis more aggressively because their constituents have been directly impacted by that increased flow. Add that all up, and it certainly doesn't equate to a Republican majority among Hispanic American voters, far from it, but it does help to explain the potential increase in support that Trump realized from these communities in last year's election.
This next questioner says, love the longer time on women in politics. Stats were great, if depressing, regarding the United States. My question is to go a little deeper regarding why the US, with all its freedoms and open political processes, has such a hard time electing a woman as our president or national leader decade after decade. What makes the US different from India, Pakistan, Australia, Argentina, Israel, and on and on? Are we deep down actually more sexist politically?
I don't think so. And I realize that that could engender a huge conversation, either in emails coming in today or for future webinars. I will say this, having looked at that list, which I had not before, of democracies and the percentages of female leaders that they had, for the most part, not completely, but for the most part, older democracies tended to fare more poorly. And my theory on that, and it's just a theory, is that when a country begins to construct a democracy in an era in which underrepresented voices, whether it's women, whether it's ethnic minorities or religious minorities, whatever it happens to be. In other words, if you become a democracy in an era in which underrepresented communities have already begun to make a broader impact on society, that impact is more likely to be reflected in politics. Whereas if you're an older democracy, and of course ours is the oldest in the world, which predated those societal advances, the advantages of incumbency and just historical tradition make it a longer term process for underrepresented voices to make the gains that they deserve. So I wouldn't pretend for a moment, and I don't want anyone to take it this way, I wouldn't pretend for a moment that the advances that we've seen in this country are satisfactory. Far from it. But I do believe that an older democracy has both structural and historical traditions which make it a slower progress. I will say this, Notes from the Cracked Ceiling, which was published in 2010 and written about the 2008 campaign, as I said earlier, is a book that I assign in my classes. And in those classes, I have young women and young men, age 19 to 22. And what's interesting to them is, well, they certainly don't see the book as a historical artifact. And they certainly believe that there is still great progress to be made. But that even while reading about an election that took place a little bit over a decade ago, they're able to see some advances and some changes and some improvements that have taken place. And as I said earlier, organizations like Emerge for Progressive Democrats, organizations like the Bergeson Institute for Conservative Republicans, organizations like Hope, Hispanos Organized for Political Equality, do phenomenal work in helping young women understand that there is no reason to wait any longer, and that rather than waiting to be recruited, that stepping forward and taking on these challenges is something that society desperately needs. So long way to go, but I think it is worth noting the progress. And I do think it is worth noting that fairly or not, a more long-term established democracy does present additional challenges, particularly in the rate of change.
The argument could be made that the story of 21st century American politics is how much Hillary Clinton is disliked by the American voter. Part of Bill Clinton's charm in the 90s was and is his marriage to Hillary, who often does not come off as likable. Would you please comment? Thanks.
Well, in fairness to Hillary Clinton, if I'd been the target of public anger over the course of 30 or 40 years, I might be a little bit guarded myself by now. And so I say that not as either a compliment or a criticism of Secretary Clinton, just an observation that she's been in the public eye for a long time. And that scrutiny, by the time she ran for president, I think had shaded, as the questioner implied, the way that she was viewed. So to me, what was really interesting about the 2020 presidential election is that not that a female leader ran for president. A woman has run for president, a credible woman has run for president in every presidential election since 1996. So that's nothing new. To me, what was different is the number of women who ran. Elizabeth Warren, Kamala Harris, of course, Kirsten Gillibrand, Tulsi Gabbard, we can go down the line. And to me, what it means when you see multiple women running for that office is it becomes much harder to stereotype what is a female candidate. It was pretty easy in 2008, and for that matter in 2016, to think about a female candidate solely in the construct of Hillary Clinton, for obvious reasons. And as the questioner correctly noted, she's not held in particularly high regard for the American people. But what we saw in 2020 was a large number of credible and impressive female leaders running for our nation's highest office and running forward in very different ways. And so my guess is that by 2024 or 2028, depending on the timeline that our group set out, I think terms like female approach to leadership, while still part of the conversation, will become less stereotypical and more descriptive and more all-encompassing and inclusive, simply because a number of different people representing a particular perspective, as that number grows, I think the different types of paths forward grow as well. So long rambling answer, but the short version of it is when we think about female leadership in some construct other than just Hillary Clinton, I think the conversation gets much more beneficial.
How do you assess today Kamala Harris's chance to be the Democratic nominee for president in 2024, and if so, to win election?
Well, Harris, simply by virtue of being the Vice President of the United States, starts with an advantage, no question about it. But the last time a sitting vice president ascended to the presidency was George Bush Sr. in 1988, so over 30 years ago. And the last time a sitting vice president had been elected president before George H.W. Bush was Martin Van Buren back in the early mid 19th century. So it's an advantage, particularly in gaining the nomination, but it's certainly not an automatic at all. And I think if President Biden does not run for re-election in 2024, or if he's reelected in 3 years, and Harris runs in 2028, she'd certainly begin as the favorite, but I can't imagine for a moment that other Democratic challenges would not emerge of both genders and of all ideologies within the party.
How has Secretary of State Blinken done in the first 100 days? Has he shown the stature to become a great Secretary of State?
Well, it's a little bit early to come to those kind of conclusions, but I have to say, I think Blinken has been a very credible Secretary of State in the first 100 days. As we've talked about in this webinar before, the Biden approach from the very beginning has been one of multilateralism, working very hard, as we were talking about earlier in today's program, working very hard to reestablish and rebuild relationships with allies in order to be as well prepared as possible to take on challenges like Russia and China and others around the world. It appears at this very early stage that Blinken has been a credible and effective spokesperson on Biden's behalf, but it's probably not fair to him to make an assessment on his greatness one way or the other until he's had a chance to serve through a much longer period of time and to serve through the series of crises that he will almost inevitably encounter, as every Secretary of State does. And I think you could say this not only about Secretaries of State, but about presidents generally. We don't know if a president is destined for greatness until we see how they conduct themselves in the face of great crisis. And so let's reserve judgment on both Blinken and Biden until we see how they handle less expected crises than the ones that they've already begun to confront.
What do you think that Biden and his administration's goals are with respect to Russia?
Well, like I said earlier, Biden sees Russia and Putin primarily as annoyances. And both Biden and Blinken are too smart to actually use a word like that. But it is a much different type of challenge than the challenge that China presents. The Chinese challenge, like I said earlier, I believe Biden sees as an existential one. And it's going to be very interesting to watch him going forward to see if he can use the specter of China to build support for his domestic political agenda, not just his foreign policy goals. Like I said, Russia is a distraction. It's an annoyance, and it can cause real problems and real crises. Cybersecurity, election interference, our relationships in Europe, certainly problems in Ukraine and elsewhere. But I don't see that Biden sees Putin, frankly, as a rival of equal stature, and he's someone more to be contained and kept in a box than to fundamentally restructure relationships with his government in his country.
Do you ever see the world's superpowers collaborating to do what's best for the world rather than what's best for them individually? And this person cited China, Russia, and the US as examples of superpowers.
Okay. Well, yeah, in the past, of course, and we've talked about this before, back in the 1970s when Richard Nixon first reached out to China, it was primarily to recruit them as a counterbalance to the antagonism between the United States and the Soviet Union. And what we're seeing now is somewhat of the flip side of that. China and Russia are seeing each other as allies to balance off the role of the United States on the world stage. Can the three countries unify? Historically, when that type of unity has emerged, it's been in the face of a common threat. And to take a hopefully silly example, if Mars attacks if Mars attacks the Earth, then you see the countries of the world come together. On a less silly and more immediate note, while the conversations haven't been as productive as many of us would like, the fact that the US and China and Russia can have collaborative conversations about working together on climate change is somewhat encouraging. Is either China or Russia doing as much as the United States would like? No. Did the United States do as much in previous years as perhaps China and Russia would have liked? No. And so there is a long way to go on this. But it has been worth noting that even while relationships between the US and China and the US and Russia have gotten more and more tense and more confrontational in any number of ways, there's at least civil conversations going on as it relates to the common threat of climate change. And I think it is that type of common challenge that brings foes together, even if they don't set aside their differences on other issues.
Thank you. Sorry, questions are coming in hot and fast. So since we talked on President Biden's speech last week and noted the presence of the Speaker and the Vice President, what do you make of Senator Tim Scott?
We did a webinar with Senator Scott last summer, if I'm not mistaken, was it, Jessica? And what was really nice is after talking with him for the better part of an hour about many topics, including criminal justice reform, we were able to have a similar conversation with Representative Karen Bass, who of course is the Democratic standard bearer on that issue. And I think two things struck me. One is that there wasn't as much difference between the two sides on police reform issues as had been commonly reported. And so it's heartening now to see Representative Bass and Senator Scott making some real progress on the issue. Otherwise, I was otherwise very impressed by Senator Scott. I did watch him attempting to straddle the line between pre-Trump conservatism and pro-Trump conservatism. And I have to admit, I don't know how much of that pro-Trump conservatism is out of what he sees as necessity for the time being, or something that's more heartfelt in him. And I think that's something that we'll learn more about over the next few years. But on balance, I thought very smart individual. And while certainly his status as the only African-American Republican in the United States Senate gives him a platform that might not be available to some of his colleagues, say, in addition to his demographic characteristics, I was impressed by him on a range of policy issues as well. So he does, represent a notable breakthrough for his party from a demographic and ethnic standpoint. But I think it would be a mistake to look at him only as an African-American Republican, as opposed to a Republican with whom you might not always agree on the issues, but who's clearly done his homework and clearly understands the intricacies of public policy very well.
Thank you. Could you speak to the Arizona audit? Sorry, it's a quick question.
Sure. So the Arizona State Legislature, as some of you may know, is still auditing the outcome of the 2020 election. And they've hired a firm without any previous background in this field to conduct a review. It doesn't appear that the review is going to overturn the results of the Arizona election. Maricopa County, in which the city of Phoenix resides, represents about 80% of the votes cast in the state of Arizona. And many of the former President Trump's strongest supporters in the Arizona State Legislature believe that there was significant voter fraud in that county's vote count. I could be wrong. I don't think that I am, but it's unlikely that they're going to find the type of fraud that they're looking for. And so in the meantime, this becomes another way for Trump's strongest supporters to argue that the election was not fairly decided. But I'd be very, 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 very surprised if anything significant changed once the votes are retallied, even by a firm without previous experience in this area and a CEO who had spoken out about the need to investigate voter fraud in the aftermath of last November's elections. So it's always worth keeping an eye on these kind of things, but I would be really I really would be flabbergasted if anything really changed as a result of this ongoing effort.
Do you think that Hispanic and Black voters who voted for Trump would vote for Republicans with more traditional Republican values?
Well, first of all, it's worth separating out the two constituencies, because while Trump did enjoy some support from a slightly larger number of particularly African-American younger males, it's still a very, very small number. I'd say that Latino voters and Asian Pacific voters, for that matter, tend to vote Republican, not in majorities, but in much larger numbers than the African American community, whose support for Democratic candidates has remained pretty steadfast for the last 70 years or so. I don't know that a lot of Republicans are going to achieve success with larger numbers of African American voters just because that constituency has been so reliably Democratic. But as we were talking earlier, the Latino and the Asian Pacific vote is less locked in. And a Republican candidate who talked about comprehensive immigration reform in addition to economic and cultural and national security conservatism could have the ability to achieve broader levels of support in those communities. You know, Trump is an outlier for all sorts of reasons on all sorts of fronts, but I think the one thing that more than any other kept him from improving his standing among Latino voters even more was such a combative, confrontational approach to the immigration issue. And I do think that a Republican who talked about for lack of a better term, a Rubio-esque approach to the issue, or for that matter, a George W. Bush approach to the issue, could probably achieve a greater success in those communities. Because while the majority of Latino voters still lean to the left, there are growing pockets of conservatism on economic and social and cultural and military issues. So it is entirely possible.
Are not Biden's proposals full of ill thought out spending on, and they say, good causes with very negative long-term fiscal consequences? Far more electric charging stations than we have gas stations, $5 billion relief fund for minority farmers, 40% of infrastructure package for previously disadvantaged communities, massive public funded good jobs. National debt will be 102% of GNP this year. Even with the tax increases, the debt as percent of GNP is projected to rise substantially over the coming years. Interest rate won't stay under 1% forever. The 10-year has already risen from 0.6% to 1.6%.
Okay, so many economists have argued that we should be less concerned about deficit spending than in years past for any number of reasons, low interest rates being one of them. Republicans have historically argued against deficits, and while they've begun to do so again, their argument is not having the same kind of impact in the past, primarily because it's not an argument they made during Trump's presidency when he was engaging in such large levels of deficit spending. I think Biden is correct in understanding that the American appetite for greater government involvement and greater government spending is highest in a time of crisis and its immediate aftermath. That's what Roosevelt demonstrated during and after the Great Depression. And Biden believes, I think with some justification, that American voters would be more receptive to that than at any time over the last 40 years or so. That said, there are warning signs for Biden. When the Washington Post did its 100-day poll, a majority of Americans, 53%, said they were either very or somewhat concerned that Biden will do too much to increase the size and role of government. So overall, Americans are almost evenly split on whether they favor a smaller government with fewer services or a larger government with more services. That said, they're evenly split now, but for years and years and years, Americans have said they'd prefer a smaller government. Biden is counting on the trajectory continuing and the numbers of Americans who support a large government continue to grow. But right now, it's pretty much a jump ball, and it's up to Biden and his allies to convince people that the money will be well spent, as opposed to being used in less productive ways. So at this point, we don't know. That is the great challenge of Biden's next 100 days and beyond, and that will be our first topic for next week. He says in his shameless promotion for next week's webinar, which, Jessica, I believe you were about to remind us, will
Yes,
take
it will be
on Wednesday.
Yes.
Rather than Tuesday. And that's just a 1-week switch. That's because I've got my final at Berkeley next Tuesday. But I hope you'll come back and see us next Wednesday. And then we'll be back on Tuesday again, the week of May 17th, then and forever.
And that also goes for the after the webinar session for members. They can sign up for that. That happens every other week. So if you're a member, you can email Christina Shabanaba, our membership director. So next week's after the webinar session will also be on Wednesday. So mark your calendars, sign up, let us know, become a member, all the things. And I'm going to turn this back over to Kim. Thank you so much.
Jessica, thank you so much. I know how many questions you receive and you manage them so well. So thank you. Dan, another terrific discussion. These should be 2 hours so we can get into the depth.
Well, we did take a little bit longer than usual on topic one, and so I hope that worked all right for everybody. But either way, we'll get to the Biden second 100 days question next week.
Thank you, Dan. And again, thank you so much for your time and expertise every week. It guides us all. I get so many compliments on your program. So thank you very, very much.
It's really nice. Thank you.
As always. For our viewers, please help us keep these important programs going. There's an easy way to make a donation. You can just text the name Schnur to the number in the chat on your control panel. Your contributions make a very big difference and they help cover our operating costs. As you know, we're providing these live streams for free. So please make a contribution today and go to our website. There's a terrific lineup of upcoming programs. In addition to Dan's program next Wednesday, as he and Jessica mentioned, tomorrow we have a conversation with Robert Refkin. It's a special Mother's Day tribute to mothers and mentors. On Thursday, Rock Me on the Water. This is a conversation with Ron Brownstein of The Atlantic and Leo Walensky, former senior editor at the Los Angeles Times, who will be reviewing Ron's new book. Next week, in addition to Dan on Wednesday, on the 13th, we have national security and the right to privacy in the digital age. On the 17th, creating opportunity from crisis, a very special program for high school students learning from the global consequences of COVID-19. We also have the ambassador of France, Philippe Etienne, coming up on the 19th. So go to the website, lawacth.org. Register for the programs, make a donation, become a member. Stay safe, and we hope to see you tomorrow. And Dan, see you next Wednesday.
Thanks so much, everybody.